Okay, maybe we'll get started so we try and stay on time. Welcome everybody to this special event. We don't have a good name for it yet, except top senior thesis presentations. I've been wanting to do this for about 22 years. The reason is that we have the great senior thesis day, but because of the parallel sessions, the faculty don't always get to see the top theses. And in particular, as you probably know, the last two Princeton valedictorians were ORFE majors. And so I always regretted not being able to see their senior thesis presentation. So this year, we had a special process where Professor Ahmadi, as punishment for being away in the fall, was tasked with reading a good bunch of senior theses and trying to select the ones that there's obviously some subjectivity that really stood out, and he'll reveal his optimization criteria in a few minutes, and it'll probably show up on the exam next semester. And so it's great that everybody that was selected was able to come. And so the purpose of this session is just there's no grading, it's just to showcase the best thesis. So there's no grading or ranking. There is recording. There's one camera here, there's one camera there, there's one camera there. Michael Bino is another one there. So if anybody wants to go full TED Talks, feel welcome. So with that, welcome everybody, and I'll turn it over to Professor Ahmadi to explain.
Thanks, Ronnie. I won't take. So what I did was to first shortlist a subset of our theses that our faculty thought were outstanding. And for each of these theses, I came up with 10 criteria. It's definitely subjective, but the criteria were creativity behind the topic and the approach, the mathematical modeling quality, the impact on the application domain, the writing quality of the thesis, mathematical depth, the computational and coding component, data analysis, literature review, analysis of the results, and then the vision of the broader context and the broader impact. So the 8 theses that you will see today scored very highly according to a weighted combination of these 10 criteria, in addition to the input of the faculty and the presentation score that they received last week. So with that, each speaker has 12 minutes plus 3 for questions. If you have clarification questions during the talk, you can ask. Just raise your hand. But any other question you may have, please leave them for the last 3 minutes. So our first speaker is Isabelle, and she's going to present her title, and she's advised by Ludo.
All right, hello, and thank you for inviting me to present today. My name is Isabelle, and for my thesis, I performed empirical analysis on the impact of women and minority ownership on private equity fundraising performance. First, why do we care about private equity? Well, private equity has become a favored haven for investors seeking to generate higher returns while improving portfolio diversification. Recent estimates suggest that private equity firms currently manage almost $5 trillion in assets, a number that could grow to over $9 trillion by 2025. This growth actually outpaces that of the larger alternative asset industry. Furthermore, the impacts of private equity are not contained to the investors who recoup its profits, but also extend to the broader economy. In the US alone, private equity firms own 18,000 companies employing 8.8 million workers, accounting for 5% of the US GDP in 2018. This suggests that there's a multiplier effect and that trends exhibited at the highest levels of private equity will trickle down to the companies they work with and manage. But for all the industry's successes, private equity has a diversity problem. The private equity industry is generally dominated by white men, particularly at the highest levels. In this figure, we see that women and minority representation among senior positions in firm ownership in private equity significantly lags not only US demographic composition, but also the US college-educated labor force composition, suggesting their lack of representation in private equity is more than a pipeline problem. These figures persist despite evidence that women and minority-owned funds' investment performance is at least as strong as their counterparts. The lag in assets managed by diverse-owned firms compared to their strong investment performance points to a difference in fundraising performance between diverse-owned firms and their counterparts. Specifically, we suggest that the lack of capital managed by diverse-owned firms may be due in part to such firms having more difficulty raising funds than their counterparts. Furthermore, we suggest that we can more precisely define exactly how fundraising performance differs across ownership types, we can better understand where this $1 trillion gap in assets managed is coming from, and more importantly, address it. Having constructed this hypothesis, we reviewed the academic literature related to it. We found that the current literature on the subject lacks both rigor and comprehensiveness. Here we see the findings and limitations of what we found to be the 3 most relevant studies to our research. We start with Josh Lerner et al.'s 2018 Diverse Asset Management Assessment. Lerner et al. Found that women-owned firms raise smaller funds on average, while minority-owned firms raise approximately equal-sized funds as their counterparts. However, Lerner only examined the mean and median without controlling for outside factors that affect fund size. Furthermore, Lerner only looked at fundraising performance through the lens of fund size, rather than taking account initial goals and subsequently funds' achievements of these goals. The second relevant study is Intolerance of Failure by Ann Lehman et al. Lehman actually worked with Lerner on this study and found that diverse-owned managers are penalized more severely for poor performance than their counterparts when fundraising. However, she largely built her research on Lerner's study, and thus, like Lerner, she broadly focused on fund size as the key measure of fundraising performance, rather than considering other measures. Finally, we consider Sarah Lyons-Padilla's et al. Study on racial influence on professional investors' financial judgments. Lyons-Padilla's key finding was that investors favor white teams when credentials are stronger, but black teams when credentials are weaker, suggesting that black teams may face more challenges even as their success increases. However, Lyons-Padilla's key findings were once again predicated on Lerner's assumption that fund size is the only measure of fundraising performance. Furthermore, Lyons-Padilla's used a limited data set of only 64 asset allocators. Yes?
Can I just ask what they mean by credentials?
Credentials, yes. So kind of based off of their resume, what they did is it was actually a psychology study. So they went to 64 asset allocators and they showed them different resumes that they had ranked themselves based off of experience. So say what college they went to, how long they'd been investing for, et cetera. For sure. So just to wrap up this side, given the significant gaps in the research and their consequences on future research, we found ample motivation for exploration of this topic with the goal of providing a more comprehensive and rigorous review of race and gender as determinants of private equity fundraising performance. With this goal in mind, we started by constructing our data set. We relied on cleaned fund data from Preqin. In this figure, you can see the number of funds that we have information on for each metric. We can see that our data set was robust, as for every metric, we had information on at least 2,000 funds, and for some metrics, as many as 23,000 funds. Within each metric, we grouped the funds by ownership. While you can see that our data set has far fewer diverse-owned funds than non-diverse-owned funds, this is actually in line with the broader population. Specifically, we see that women-owned funds represent about 4 to 6% of our data set, depending on the variable of interest, which is in line with Lerner et al.'s finding that women-owned firms represent 5.2% of private equity firms. Similarly, minority-owned firms represent 2 to 4% of our data set, which is also in line with Lerner et al.'s finding that minority-owned firms represent 3.9% of private equity firms. This gives us confidence that our data set forms a representative sample of the population. To address the issue of comprehensiveness found in our literature review, we studied fundraising performance through 3 different questions, which we further broke out into 7 different metrics. First, we asked, what is the relationship between diverse ownership and fundraising performance? We measured, and fundraising goals. We measured 2 fundraising goals: target size, which is the amount of capital a firm expects to raise, and hard cap, which is the amount of capital that a firm will ultimately accept. We then asked, what is the relationship between diverse ownership and fundraising goal achievement? We first looked at fund size alone, which is the total amount of capital that fund ultimately raises. And then we considered how a firm's final fund size compares to their initial target by calculating the percentage of target achieved. And finally, we looked at the oversubscription rate, which is the proportion of firms which met or exceeded their hard caps. And for our last question, we asked, what is the relationship between diverse ownership and time and market? Here we looked at 2 measures of time and market. First, the number of months it took a fund to reach their first close, and then the number of months it took them to reach their final close. To address the issue of rigor found in our literature review, we applied both probability density and regression analysis. For every metric, we started with a probability density analysis, where we compared the mean value of women-owned funds, minority-owned funds, and women and minority-owned funds to see if there's a statistically significant difference in those values. If we did find a statistically significant difference for any of the ownership types, we then applied regression analysis to that performance metric to determine if the relationship between the ownership type and the fundraising performance metric held when controlling for outside factors. We did this by constructing a weighted least squares regression model with backwards-looking feature selection to reduce multicollinearity. Our model had 3 explanatory variables: women ownership, minority ownership, and then an interaction term between women and minority ownership. I do want to emphasize here that since the woman and minority ownership term is an interaction term, we're not measuring whether this ownership type has an effect at all, but rather whether it has an effect beyond the combined effects of woman ownership and minority ownership. And then, in addition to our explanatory variables, we included up to 9 control variables, which accounted for a number of factors across industry, geography, and time. We then conducted t-tests on the coefficients of our explanatory variables to determine whether there was in fact evidence of a direct relationship between diverse ownership and fundraising performance. And finally, we calculate the correlation coefficients between our explanatory variables and control variables to understand the additional correlational effects on diverse funds' fundraising performance. We'll now go through each of our initial questions and explain our key findings. We start with the question of the relationship between diverse ownership and fundraising goals. We find that diverse-owned firms set lower targets than their counterparts on average. This relationship is largely explained by the direct negative effects of diverse ownership on target size, but is also partially influenced by several correlations that further decrease average target size among diverse-owned firms. Interestingly, correlations between diverse ownership and vintage year and firm experience suggest that we should expect target size among diverse-owned firms to increase in the coming years. Subsequently, we find that women-owned funds tend to set lower hard caps than their peers, primarily due to the fact that they're setting lower initial targets. More interestingly, when we control for target size, we find that women and minority-owned funds set higher hard caps than their peers, allowing them the potential to overperform on their fundraising targets. We now consider the relationship between diverse ownership and achievement of fundraising goals. We find that without any controls, women-owned and women and minority-owned funds tend to raise smaller funds than their counterparts. However, when controlling for outside factors, we find that while women ownership alone again tends to lead to smaller fund sizes, minority-owned and women and minority-owned funds tend to perform in line with or even better than their peers. Taking it a step further, when we take into account their initial targets, we find evidence that diverse-owned funds achieve their fundraising targets at least the same levels as their peers, both with and without controlling for outside factors. This tells us that when benchmarked against their own goals, diverse-owned firms are successful in achieving them. This is a particularly important observation because, as we saw, women ownership tends to lead to lower fund sizes. Thus, in the absence of target achievement, we might consider women-owned firms to have poor fundraising performance. However, when we benchmark them against their own goals rather than the goals of their peers, we can see that they're consistently achieving their own goals. Finally, in line with their peers, over 40% of diverse-owned funds are oversubscribed, suggesting that many funds' demand exceeds not only their targets, but their capital management capabilities. Overall, when compared to their own benchmark, diverse-owned firms match the performance of their counterparts. As demonstrated in the previous slides, while diverse-owned funds may set lower initial targets to their counterparts, in the case of women-owned funds, subsequently raise smaller funds, they consistently achieve and even outperform their stated goals. Finally, we consider the relationship between diverse ownership and time and market. While the results of our first months to first close analysis were inconclusive, we find strong evidence of a positive relationship between women ownership and minority ownership and months to final close. In the case of women-owned funds, there appears to be evidence of a direct relationship between women ownership and time market. In the case of minority-owned funds, there's a correlation relationship due to their positive association with smaller fund numbers, which in turn tend to lead to a longer period of time spent fundraising. In both cases, the ultimate outcome is a longer period of time spent fundraising, which retracts from the time they have to make investments and thus could handicap their investment performance. We end by summarizing our key findings. First and foremost, we find that even when controlling for outside factors, there is a difference in fundraising performance between diverse-owned funds and their counterparts. In particular, diverse-owned funds consistently set lower initial targets than their counterparts. Since our results suggest that diverse-owned funds are capable of achieving their targets at similar rates as their peers, we suggest that by addressing the forces that cause the initial gap in target sizes, we can partially address the gap in capital managed by diverse-owned funds and their counterparts. Based on conversations with experienced diverse managers in the industry, we propose that diverse-owned firms are systematically propelled to set lower targets than their peers, not due to a lack of ability to manage higher amounts of capital, but rather due to implicit and structural biases from their investors. Thank you, and I'll open up to questions.
Thank you, Isabelle, for staying exactly on time. There's some seats down here for those who just walked in if you want to take a seat. Any questions for Isabelle? Alan.
Let me see if I understand what you found.
Sure.
Or what you're saying. If what I state is not correct, then please correct me. That basically what you found is that this industry, if you're a minority or a woman-owned firm, you're somehow convinced to ask for less, and because you're asking for less, you get that. But you certainly don't get what you should have been asking for.
Exactly. And I have a reason that I think of why they're asking for less.
Why are they asking for less?
Here we go. And this is the less worthy part of my thesis.
I mean, I can't wait to hear what you say, but I mean, this is major.
Yeah. So what's happening is, and this is based off of 2 conversations with diverse-owned managers. So certainly this is an area that we should explore more and we should do a broader study on. But I think it provides us a good area of where we should be targeting our questions when we do these studies. What I found in my conversations is that what's happening is diverse-owned firms are seen as a riskier investment. And this is for a couple reasons. First, they're probably coming from less traditional backgrounds than their non-diverse counterparts. They may have a little bit less experience in the industry because they're having a hard time breaking in initially. So that's make them look riskier. There's also an implicit bias of when I'm making a big investment with a lot of money, I want to invest in what I know. And what I know is a white firm that I've seen be successful in the past. So there's also some implicit biases that we've seen that in psych studies. So again, less ORFE, but psych studies. So that's the first proposal, is that this seems riskier to me. So what happens is these big pension funds, endowments, don't want to give money to diverse-owned firms. So where do they go out and they get their money from? They go to emerging manager programs. And emerging manager programs are established programs that are set aside to give money specifically to new managers. And that's often tied to diverse managers. So usually one requirement is I'm an earlier fund, I'm raising a little bit less money, and then a second requirement, oftentimes in parallel, is that they're a diverse manager. And these programs are awesome. They help jumpstart funds, they support them. The problem with these programs is that one of the major requirements of them will often be that I have to set my target size at a certain level. I usually can't exceed either $500 million or $1 billion. So what's happening is a diverse-owned fund will go out and raise money from emerging manager programs. They'll get off the ground, which is great, but then they become more successful. And then they say, hey, I think I'm ready to manage $1.5 billion. I think I've proved myself. Well, if I want to go do that, I can't go out and get money from these emerging manager programs anymore. I've graduated. I have to go out and get new investors. And that's not an easy thing to do. The industry standard is that you're going to start with a group of investors, and they're going to stay with you. And yeah, you'll pull in 1 or 2 new investors for every fund you raise. But the industry standard is I'm really going to stick with that core group. So now what we're asking these diverse-owned funds to do is say, hey, you've proven yourself. You're ready to manage more money. Now you have to go out and you have to get an entirely new set of investors. And that's tough to do. So what they're doing is they're setting their targets below these caps, keeping at $900 million, even when they're ready to raise more money. So that's kind of one of the main structural issues with how we're funding these firms and how we're thinking about supporting them. So one of my suggestions, and again, this is one area, there's definitely different components to this, but one of my suggestions is we should rethink how we're structuring these emerging manager programs. So either they're not based off of setting caps on target sizes, and they're saying, yes, you need to be new. Maybe you need to be diverse, but you don't need to be setting a cap of $1 billion. And my second suggestion is if we want to keep these caps, we need to think about better supporting these firms as they graduate from emerging manager programs. So creating pathways where we're introducing them to new investors when we're letting them go.
Thank you so much. I think we're out of time. I have a question, but I'm going to have to leave it for the reception. And if you have questions, please leave it for the reception. Let's thank you. Great. Our second speaker is Joyce Luo. She's advised by Professor Bartolomeo Stellato. Go ahead.
Hi everyone, my name is Joyce, and today I will be presenting about my thesis, which is related to equitable data-driven resource allocation to fight the opioid epidemic, and I'm thankful to have been advised by Professor Stellato for this work. So the U.S. opioid epidemic is a crisis that has plagued the United States for decades. It has been driven by prescription, illicit, and synthetic opioid use, which has led to higher rates of opioid use disorder and in turn higher rates of overdose deaths. So according to the CDC, there have been around 500,000 deaths involving both illicit and prescription opioids from 1999 to 2019. And the COVID-19 pandemic has only exacerbated the opioid epidemic. So there have been 27% more deaths between September 2019 through August 2020 compared to the preceding 12-month period. So the pandemic has really brought to the forefront this need for expanded access to opioid treatment services. So the main treatment for opioid use disorder is medication-assisted treatment, or MAT. And in particular, the medications used for this are methadone and buprenorphine. So these two medications are specifically used for maintenance treatment, which means that patients need to go and take these medications at regular intervals and then wean off of them in order to be successfully treated for opioid use disorder. But a major issue with this is treatment retention. So if a patient is really far away from a treatment facility, they're not going to be likely to stay on this treatment. And there are still major gaps in access to MAT across the United States. So this begs the question, how can we make sure MAT is more accessible and allocated equitably? So our approach focuses on two main aspects: opioid treatment facility location and treatment budget allocation. So we integrate a predictive model with a prescriptive optimization problem in order to address these two aspects for each state. So our predictive model is from epidemiology. It's a compartmental model based on Sayre infectious disease models. So Sayre models partition a population into 4 different population classes and then model the transitions between these classes based on infectious disease dynamics. So we do something similar where we have 6 population classes. So we have the susceptible class, the prescribed class, which is people that use or misuse opioids. We have an illicit use class, which is people that use heroin. And then we have an addicted class, rehabilitated class, and deceased class. And these parameters that you can see on the arrows are how the population transitions between these classes. And the dynamics can be represented by a system of ordinary differential equations, which are dependent on a set of learned parameters like the ones row that we described. And this is just the general form of an ordinary differential equation. And for these parameters, we can set them based on previous literature, but a lot of them are unknown, so we need to set them based on real-world data. And this is where the machine learning technique neural ODEs comes in. So in order to explain neural ODEs, we need to start with how do we solve an ODE problem. So we use a numerical ODE solver, which takes in inputs. It takes in the initial state of the system, a set of parameters rho, and a time span. And then it outputs a time series vector, which shows how the system evolves from its initial to final state. So this is similar to a neural network layer, which is basically just a simple function that maps inputs to outputs, and it's differentiable and also is parameterized by weights and biases, which are just the parameters. So Chen et al. Put 2 and 2 together, and they created this neural ODE framework, which basically embeds an ODE solver and the corresponding ODE problem into a neural network layer. And this makes it easy for us to train a single layer neural ODE model on yearly real-world data for each of the state's compartment values to get the parameters. And we used gradient-based optimizers to efficiently minimize a loss function to make sure our model's predictions are close to the real-world data. In terms of data sources, we use data from the Substance Abuse and Mental Health Administration and the Center for Disease Control. So now that we have these learned parameters, we can integrate this compartmental model into an optimization problem. So we developed a mixed integer bilinear optimization problem for each state. So for our decision variables, we have the number of treatment facilities in each county and the treatment budget in each county. And then we're aiming to minimize the number of opioid-related deaths and the number of people with OUD. Additionally, we also wanted to take into account socioeconomic factors. So we tried to incorporate county opioid prescribing rates and social vulnerability indices into our objective. So social vulnerability indices are created by the CDC, and they're basically measures of like how much a county needs help during a public health emergency. So we wanted counties with higher social vulnerability indices to have like more treatment facilities. And then we also tried to incorporate the county population distributions because we wanted our treatment budgets to be close to the county population distribution. In terms of constraints, we wanted to bound the decision variables using budgetary information. And then the most important constraints were this discretized compartmental model that we created previously. And basically, we wanted to optimize our decision variables based on how they affected this compartmental model. So we created this term with the decision variables that affected like a particular model parameter, which models the transition rate between the addicted class and the rehabilitating class. So in terms of results, we had a large set of results because we did this for almost every state, but I'm going to show the ones for New York. So on the left, we can see that this figure is comparing the model's predictions to real-world data. And we can see that our model does pretty well at fitting to the real-world data. So in particular for the deceased class, we can see that the model captures this increase in the number of deaths. And then we can also notably see that the prescribed class population proportion is much larger than the others because more people use or misuse opioids compared to those who develop OUD or die from opioid use. And then on the right, we have a figure of how the loss progresses over 20,000 trading iterations. So we can see that the loss decreases over time and then eventually levels off, which means that the model is fitting pretty well to the data. So after training, we were able to obtain a set of learned parameters for each state. And we can see the parameters for New York below, which I interpret more in my thesis. In terms of our optimization model solutions, again, we had a large set of solutions for each state, but I'm going to show the ones for Florida. So on the right, we can see that this is the additional number of facilities per county that the optimization problem solution recommends. So we can see that for most counties, they recommend one additional treatment facility, but then for some counties like Miami-Dade, for example, which is the yellow county at the bottom, recommends 9 additional facilities. And then in terms of the treatment budget solutions for a particular time period, we can see that it did quite a good job of matching up with the county population distributions because Miami-Dade, again, is the most populous county in Florida, so it has the largest treatment budget allocation. In terms of equity considerations, as I said before, we also are trying to take into account socioeconomic factors. So our MIP did end up allocating additional treatment facilities to certain counties that had higher SVI rankings. However, we did notice that since certain counties already had a large number of current facilities because they had large populations, the distributions weren't exactly able to match up between the number of facilities distribution and the SVI distribution. But our model did allocate at least one additional facility to most counties that had higher SVI rankings. So our MIPs did yield different solutions for each state, which means that there was differential impact. But on average, after 2 years, our solutions decreased the number of people with OUD by 5.76%, increased the number of people in treatment by 21.6%, and decreased the number of opioid-related deaths by 0.52%, which we think is pretty significant. So in conclusion, we developed an integrated optimization approach that considers complex opioid epidemic dynamics for the purpose of opioid treatment facility location and treatment budget allocation. We also took into account socioeconomic factors in order to make our solutions more equitable. And we contributed to opioid epidemic modeling literature by showing the usefulness of neural ODEs for parameter fitting. So we believe that this framework could serve as a bouncing point for future opioid epidemic optimization research, and further refined iterations of this approach could be used by policymakers to inform decision-making regarding the opioid epidemic in the future. Thank you.
Any questions for Joyce? Brennan.
So in terms of minimizing the number of deaths,
Yeah.
did you consider or did you have any data on naloxone? And the fact that in many cities they give that to public library and to say, if someone has an overdose, you can revert it using this drug. Did you use that?
Yeah, so that was actually a factor I was considering taking into account. That would have perturbed another one of my model parameters. But I wasn't able to find very good data on that, and I don't think it fit exactly in with what my two objectives were. So that would definitely be something I would consider in future work.
Any questions? I have one. I wanted to know more about how your optimization problem interacts with the dynamics. Is the output being used as a control to change the dynamics?
So I have the optimization problem on the slides if you want to look.
Sure,
But
why not?
yeah. So
Yeah.
I mean, okay. So these, so 4.4 through 4.9 are the discretized compartmental model. So that was how, and then
So you first fit the ODE,
Yes.
discretize it.
yes, then I discretized it, and then
And
you
then
can
how
see
does
in the
output of
objective.
this change the dynamics?
Yeah, so you can see in the objective, I incorporate the number of deaths. I'm trying to minimize the number of deaths and the number of people with OUD. And then incorporating this in, so I added this extra term that incorporates the decision variable. So XI is one of the decision variables, and so is DIK, that's the treatment budget, and then XI is the number of treatment facilities. And then this term is added to the parameter that determines the transition rate between the addicted class and the rehabilitating class. So depending on how the model optimizes this term, that perturbs the model parameters and then affects the overall model, compartmental model.
Thank you. Well, we appreciate you not showing us this slide before. Any other questions? Okay, if not, let's thank Joyce again. So this is the last talk before break, and I have to mention that after all the 8 talks are over, we have a reception in room 125, just a few doors down. The next speaker is Caroline, advised by Renner here.
All right, awesome. Thank you all so much for coming. It's so great to see you here, and thank you for the honor of getting to present my thesis again. So I'm excited to share what I worked on this year, and I looked at the impact of carbon price on power plant dispatch, production costs, and total emissions. And I got the privilege of working with Professor Carmona. Thank you so much for all the time and help. So to start, I just wanted to give a little background to the energy market. The energy market functions much like any financial market, so supply must match demand. We can see on this left graph that supply is provided by generators, generators of many different types. So different fuel types will have different costs, and you can see this generation stack of the different costs that the fuel types may have. In addition, when choosing how much each generator should produce, there are 2 main steps. So first is the unit commitment step, which takes into account the day-ahead forecast and then decides which generators to turn on and off based on this day-ahead forecast. Then, once we get into the real-time forecast, though, the economic dispatch is chosen. So based on how much comes in the real time, we have to decide, okay, how much should each generator actually produce? All of this is formulated into a larger optimization problem, namely to minimize the total cost while continuing to meet this necessary demand. For the purposes of this thesis, I used the Reliability Test System, or RTS, which is just a synthetic grid that covers a geographical region from about Los Angeles to Las Vegas, so about 250 by 250 miles, and it has this combination of generators in it. Also provides day-ahead and real-time data forecasts, which I used throughout the project. Various unit commitment and economic dispatch formulations were run through a Python-based program called Prescient, which uses a cost minimizing optimization to solve this overall energy problem. So RTS takes into account the following inputs, as we see on the left, which are the forecasts, the generator and bus and branch detail, and which has fuel type, minimum, maximum power, and other details. Takes this all into account and produces these output files. Some just that I want to mention that are important to my thesis are the exact generator dispatch amounts for the thermal and the renewable generators, the total cost throughout the optimization, and renewables curtailment, which is a topic I will touch on later in my presentation. So now I've given a little background of the energy market. I want to touch on the topic of my thesis, which is how carbon policies are going to affect this optimization problem. So many states have carbon emissions laws. One of the prominent ones is California's cap and trade policy. And this one, in California, they determine a cap on the amount of carbon for each year, and then they allocate allowances to each company. So each entity in the system gets a certain amount of allowances, but can also maintain more through an auction. These auctions are held quarterly, and as we can see in the figure on the left, the prices have been drastically increasing since the cap and trade has been put into place in 2014. In addition, there is a futures contract market. I've just provided a screenshot of the Bloomberg terminal for this futures market, but this just helps simulate the daily prices of carbon, and I took these into account when looking at daily prices for my thesis. So now moving into my project work, I wanted to look at how would adding a cost of carbon to the Princeton optimization in RTS affect its overall power plant dispatch and total carbon emissions. So for the sake of time, I will not go into all the nitty-gritty details, but if you have questions afterwards, I'm more than happy to answer. But I focused on two main steps of project work. First, just how much carbon emission was happening in each simulation. So each simulation outputs the total amount of dispatch that each generator will have, but it doesn't say how much carbon that each generator emits. It only provides the carbon emissions rate. So I added this as an output of the system. And then second, looked at adding the price of carbon to the optimization. So currently, it only optimizes upon the fuel cost, but I wanted to look at what if we added the carbon cost also to the optimization? How would this change the dispatch of the generators? So moving into my results and analysis, first, I just wanted to look at, in the overall picture, how was this affecting carbon emissions? And what I found is, as we can see in these graphs, the x-axis is the price of carbon per ton, dollar per ton, that I put into the system. We can see that as I increased the price, the total carbon emissions decreased, but it flattened out at about a price of $50 per ton. So this made me ask, what in the system is causing the total carbon emissions to decrease, yet flatten out, even though I'm continuing to raise the price past $50? So for the next few slides, I'll show some of the more specific details that might have contributed to this effect. First, I found in my project that as I increased the price of carbon, there was significant coal to gas switching. So we can see here that by the price of $50 per ton, the gas, which is in the orange curve, has greatly has become more prominent than the coal. So, but another thing we see is that the gas generators cannot actually be turned all the way off. So there still needs to be something that's satisfying this demand due to the optimization needing to satisfy the demand. So even though all the gas generators have been activated at this point, that doesn't mean you can continue to reduce the carbon because they still have to be producing the carbon somehow, or the energy somehow. So this is the first finding. Another interesting finding was that carbon does not relate only to the total megawatts produced. So just to show you as an example here, I have a graph of the total megawatts of one day broken down by different type of generator, and then a graph of the total carbon emissions. So for this example, I'll just use the gas generators. The gas generators you can see are in the green here. So in hours 0 to 4, it looks like there's about half the total megawatts produced than in hours 16 to 20. However, when you look at the total carbon emission, you see a much, much smaller amount compared to the peak amount of carbon emitted in the later hours. And what I found here is that the carbon emission did not correspond directly to the megawatts, but rather to the amount of BTU that each generator was using. So it really mattered the heat rate curve of each generator and its efficiency, and that came into play when looking at the total amount of carbon, not only the total amount of megawatts that have to be produced. Some other little findings were that, one, oil was not used nearly as much as I thought it would be used. Because oil does have a pretty low carbon emissions rate. In the system, it only had 170 MMBTU per pound, pound per MMBTU, whereas gas had 160 pound per MMBTU, and coal had 210 pound per BTU, so much greater. But it's still, even at this simulation, which is the highest price that I ran, you can see the oil is only in the pink, so it's very small. And just the thing that was causing this is that the price of oil, the fuel price, was still so high that its low carbon emissions rate could not overcome its low its high fuel price. And finally, so RTS only has one nuclear generator, but every single simulation I ran included a max capacity of this nuclear generator. You can see it in the maroon here. And unfortunately, RTS did not have more nuclear generators to look at how this would impact the total carbon emissions, but I just thought this was a very significant fact and should be studied a lot more going into the future. Final thing I want to look at is this phenomenon in California called the duck curve. So with California's large push for more renewable energy, analysts have looked at how this impacts the overall load. And this is a graph of the net load, which by definition is the difference between the forecasted demand and the expected demand from renewables. So we can see here that when the sun comes up around like 6 a.m., the total net load starts decreasing because the sun is producing solar energy. But then when it goes back down and people are still at work needing energy, the net load goes way back up. So I reproduced these curves in my own system, and you can see the duck curve here in the yellow. But what I wanted to point out is something interesting, which I also decided to graph, were these orange bars. And these represent the renewables curtailment. So this is when solar comes onto the grid, but it's more solar than we were expecting to come on. So thermal generators are already turned on to satisfy this demand we thought we would have and wouldn't be able to meet. However, the solar and the thermal together is too much, so to prevent overgeneration, because the thermal generators cannot ramp down quick enough, this renewables curtailment happens. Obviously, this is not a good thing because we want to be able to use the solar that's coming onto the grid. So I looked at what was causing the renewables curtailment in my grid. And what I found is that it was heavily dependent on the forecast, that when there was an underestimate of the solar and wind forecast, but also an overestimate of the load. So this means that in the real-time data, more solar came onto the grid than we expected, but equal to or less than the load came onto the grid. If there were more load than we had expected, this could be used to satisfy this extra, to use this extra solar. But these are the days that had curtailment are in the red, and this is the conclusion that we found with respect to the forecast. So I just want to touch on the renewables because although raising the price of carbon does encourage the use of more renewable generators, renewable sources are also extremely unpredictable and cannot currently be used to satisfy the entire grid's demand, which I think is another factor to this lower cap on the amount of carbon because renewables cannot be used to create a zero carbon grid. So again, the conclusion in my thesis was that increasing the price of carbon does decrease the total emission, but to a lower cap. And just to recap one more time, some of these little details that might have caused this overall trend are the coal to gas switching, the efficiency and difference of heat rate curves of generators, the fuel price that still factors into this optimization, and the impact of renewables. So finally, I just wanted to look at how this might correlate to policy recommendations. And of course, this is for the scope of my thesis only with respect to the RTS grid. But for this RTS grid, I found that if you were to increase the lowest carbon price while decreasing carbon the most amount possible, $50 per ton would be a reasonable price. Again, this is specific to the RTS grid, but I think it's really promising in looking at other grids and implementing this same idea. And finally, I just wanted to touch on what could still be done, some of the inaccuracies possibly. And one is that I think it would be interesting to implement a more flexible forecast. I used one forecast for the year of 2020 that RTS provides, but obviously having a more flexible one would be great. In addition, refining the market dynamics would be good because RTS simply assigns costs to each generator based on its carbon and fuel price and doesn't take into account that people in the market actively bid to determine the price. In addition, I implemented just a constant tax on carbon. However, I think it'd be really interesting moving forward to look at the cap and trade dynamics. So putting a cap on the total amount of carbon, and then also taking into account maybe some of the California auction prices. And this would require a lot more simulations as it would be different prices each day or each quarter, but it could help look at the impact of the cap and trade on the total carbon emissions. Finally, as I talked on briefly, I think that hydro and nuclear are both areas that are low carbon, especially nuclear, but have very high potential and should be looked further into in the future. And I will open up to questions now. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Questions for Ellen? Go ahead.
Of course, I have a question. You basically assume that the demand for electricity in this area was constant, varied throughout the day according to the forecast. It was basically at a measure constant. Of course, I'm going to ask you, if we converted 10% of the vehicle fleet in that and started using electricity.
This is not a question, it's a statement, right?
No, I'm asking if there's a substantial increase in the base demand for electricity, I don't care where it comes from. What happens here? What do you think happens here with all these dynamics where you're constrained on nuclear, all that's, where do you think this goes? I mean, it's a 10% increase and 20% increase in electricity. Where do you think it goes? What happens here?
So you're saying demand significantly increases 10-20%?
Yeah. You know, right now it's 1. Goes up to 1. It goes up to 1.2. 20% increase. What happens in all this dynamics of both the pricing, the whatever, and so on? Where's the electricity come from?
Are you taxing the electricity?
Whatever you want to do. What would you recommend if all of a sudden, instead of facing a demand of 1, you face the demand of 1.2, whatever that that magnifier is on the whole system?
So I think that with zero cost of carbon, you're going to turn on more coal plants. Those are the most efficient, lowest fuel price.
So we have to mine more coal and find more coal for it. Is that what you just said?
Not all the coal plants are being used they're not at their max capacity in the system. But then as you increase the price, then you're going to put more into the gas plants, as I showed, because it's less carbon emission.
And we have gas plants to be able to get the gas to do that. I mean, I'm just in your mind.
No,
what all the work that you did.
Didn't Mitt Romney say you can't put a windmill in your car?
I think the whole place is in trouble, is what I'm trying to suggest, and I think you've worked at it, in terms of the dynamics of what's happened with the resources that you have. You found that, oh my goodness, we need some more nuclear. We're gonna close the nuclear plants, never mind. And all of a sudden, where do you get this stuff to create it? I don't know. Anyway.
Yes, please.
Okay. So first, I'm sorry your advisor made you use that grid optimization software, which I know very well, and you're still smiling.
Here we go.
But that'll be recorded out. That'll be bleeped out of the recording. My question is, so if I understood it, during the 0 to 4 hour, there's not relatively carbon emissions because the generators picked have an efficient, heat rate conversion. But later in the day, they can't. The less efficient ones come in and make it more. So does the software does it choose to minimize emissions? So in the 0 to 4 hour, it's picking the ones that will minimize emissions, or is it that those bid at lower cost and get picked when there's low demand?
So the software I do not believe it takes into account the carbon emissions. But that's a great question because when I was looking at it, it did naturally choose the ones with the more efficient heat rate curves. But I think why that happens is because now that I think about it, the fuel price is also in dollars per MMBTU. So if it's going to maximize on the BTU also, then the fuel price is correspondent to the BTU. And if it's minimizing the fuel cost, is going to choose the most efficient heat rate curves. Does that make sense?
I think so, yeah.
So both the carbon emissions and fuel price are dependent on the same heat rate curve.
Okay, so we're a little bit behind schedule, so let me stop it here. We have a short break with coffee outside, and we come back here at 4 sharp. I think Harry's Go on, the next speaker is Harry, advised by Ronnie Serkar here. Go. The floor is yours.
Thanks so much for coming to listen to these presentations. I'm Hari. I'm going to be presenting my senior thesis, Lighting Up Dark Pools, advised by Professor Ronnie Serkar. So just to get us started off the bat, what are dark pools? So we're familiar with traditional stock exchanges. We'll call them lit exchanges, where such as NYSE or NASDAQ, where someone goes to a market and they place an order, say they place a limit order, and that gets posted so everyone who interacts in this market can see the order. In addition to that, everyone who interacts in this market can see when trades are actually executed. So all this information is available to all the market participants. Dark pools are different in that when you send an order to a dark pool, only the dark pool managers can see that. The other traders don't have access to that information. They don't know when people are placing orders. They don't know what price people are placing orders at. And they also don't know when trades are executed. So the key points that we have here are hidden order flow, which means that no one can see the orders. And then also internal trade matching. When you go to a lit pool, you can already see, hey, if people are willing to buy at some price, I can go sell to them. But a dark pool, you don't know that, and the dark pool is responsible for matching people's orders together. And dark pools have become increasingly popular in recent years. Some estimate that over 40% of US equity trading occurs in off-exchange pools, including these dark pools. So when people consider trading in dark pools versus lit pools, the key trade-off is that when we're trading in a dark pool, since our information isn't revealed to other traders, there's minimal market impact. The downside, however, is that we aren't sure if our orders are actually going to be executed because we don't have access to the order book. So that's the key trade-off when trading in a dark pool. Dark pools, while they have become popular, are also controversial. So the European Union has taken some steps to limit trading in dark pools. There's been regulation to cap what percentage of a security's trading volume can occur in dark pools. And then in the US, dark pools have been gone after by regulatory agencies for things like false marketing and exploiting customer data. The main problem is that since there's a lack of transparency, no one can see what exactly they're doing, how they're matching orders, there's more room for shady activity to occur. So the motivating question that we have for this thesis is, can we inform how dark pools should be regulated based on some of the benefit they might bring to traders? So the way we're going to investigate the benefit they bring to traders is through a model called the dark pool problem, which has been introduced in previous literature. So this model that we're going to describe is a discrete time model. We have t discrete time steps. And in that, we have n different dark pools. So in each of these discrete time steps, we have some amount that we want to trade. But the question that we have is, how do we distribute our orders over these different dark pools? So we're just going to, at every time, we're going to place VT orders to some combination of these dark pools. And the thing that we're trying to balance is we want to find the dark pools that have liquidity. So the key assumption that we make is that the distribution of liquidity at each pool is constant over time. So essentially, this becomes a learning problem where we're placing orders. When we place an order, we learn how much of that order has been executed. So what we are actually, the feedback that we're getting is the minimum of how much liquidity was available at the pool to be executed and the order size that we place. So we learn that, and then as we go through time, we're trying to get better and better at allocating our orders. So this is a problem that has been studied in previous literature. We make an extension to that by adding a lit pool to this problem as well. So now we have a lit pool where we know how much we can trade, but we also introduce a market impact model in this. So now our question is, how do we allocate orders to these n dark pools plus the lit pool while balancing the market impact when we trade in the lit pool with the execution certainty that we would get in this case? So an algorithm that we have to solve this, ultimately we can break it up into two steps. We're going to have a greedy allocation of orders that we'll describe in a bit. And the way we're going to keep track of the distribution of liquidity is through a Kaplan-Meier estimator for censored data. So we'll talk about that first. So what we're trying to estimate is a tail probability of the liquidity that's available at each pool. But since we're not directly observing how much liquidity, we have to take one extra step. So basically, we have estimators for how much liquidity, for the probability that liquidity is exactly some value, given that it is at least some value. And then, based on that, we can reconstruct the tail probabilities. So we estimate each of these, we call them Z's, based on how many direct observations we have. We know we have a direct observation of the liquidity when the response that we get is less than the order size we've placed. And then we divide that by the number of times that we've seen at least that many units. And that allows us to kind of reconstruct our tail probability estimate. We also have an optimistic shift, we call it, where we basically tell our algorithm that there's slightly more liquidity available than we are actually estimating there to be. The reason we do this, when we simulate in practice, doesn't have much difference, but in order to get the convergence results we want, we need to have this. So now this greedy allocation looks like a lot of words, but it ends up being pretty simple. So basically, we take the VT orders that we're trying to distribute, and we allocate them to a pool one by one. So we pick the pool that we estimate to have the highest probability of having one additional unit of liquidity available. The change that we make now is we also have this market impact parameter. So we introduce a linear market impact model. So basically, every unit that we allocate to the lit pool is going to induce a price impact on all of our future orders. So when we're allocating to a lit pool, we just have that market impact that we're balancing out. And so we show that this greedy allocation maximizes the expected number of units that are executed minus some market impact parameter that's based on the model that we've introduced. So we have this algorithm, and we show some theoretical results for how it works, but we also take a look at how it works in a simulated manner. So we choose to simulate over 60 time steps, which is approximately a trading quarter, over 6 dark pools. The way we do this is we fix the vector v, which again is how much we want to execute in every time step. And then we also fix the liquidity distributions for each dark pool. And then when we're trading in a lit pool, this is revealed to the algorithm, so the algorithm can use this information. And then we get to implement each of our algorithms. We implement the existing algorithms in addition to our modified algorithm for the lit pool case. So the results of our simulation look something like this, and we'll kind of break down what this means. Basically, on the left, we have a plot where in the blue, we have that vector v. So that's how much we want it to be executed. And in the orange, we have how much was actually executed. So we'll notice that as time goes on, the orange line kind of ends up reaching the minimum of the blue line and the green line. The green line isn't available to traders while they're conducting this algorithm, but we added in for the sake of simulation. Basically, the best we can hope for is that we've executed the minimum of what was available and what we actually wanted. The reason that in the beginning we see that it kind of dips down is because at the beginning we haven't learned how to allocate our orders. So we're essentially randomly placing our orders to all these dark pools, but as we learn the liquidity distributions, we get better and better at placing these orders. And the liquidity distributions that we see are on the right, and basically what this is after this we have 60 time steps, we've plotted our estimated and the actual tail distributions for the liquidity that's available in each pool. And we'll see that some pools have much greater and much more noticeable convergence than others. And that's because these are the pools that we end up placing a greater quantity of orders to, so we're seeing a lot more direct observations there. So we get greater convergence in these cases. So the two graphs that we had in the previous slide were both from dark pools. So now we also take a look, we're both in settings when we only had dark pools. So now we take a look at what happens when we add a lit pool. On the left, we have a graph of just what's happening at the single lit pool that we added. So again, in orange, we have how much liquidity was available, and in blue, we had how much we decided to execute. So this time, the orange line is actually information that's available to the algorithm. So we're choosing exactly how much of that we want to take. And we see that this is kind of increasing as we go over time, which makes sense because as we continue going through our algorithm, the amount that we have left to trade in the future is decreasing. So the market impact that we have from every order in a lit pool is also decreasing, so we're more incentivized to place orders in a lit pool. And on the right, we've made a different change to this model. We've basically greatly increased the amount of liquidity that should be available at a lit pool to the point where if we wanted to, we could have executed all of our orders at a lit pool. We wanted to do this to see if, as time goes on, are we basically having kind of a more binary behavior where we're either taking all of the liquidity from the lit pool or not at all. But we see that we do have cases where even though we desire a much higher amount of orders to be executed, we're still only taking a smaller amount of liquidity from the lit pool because of that market impact model that we've introduced. The final thing that we did when working on this was we thought about what would happen if we were parameterizing these liquidity distributions. All the models that we had previously were learning the distributions entirely from scratch. So we're basically learning, a tail CDF value for every, interesting value that we might have. So now what happens if we just assume a parameterization? So this, is greatly reducing the search space. It's making the problem a lot simpler. And so we assume they're Poisson distributed. We can learn the parameters for this Poisson model instead of trying to learn the entire distribution. The takeaway from this isn't that liquidity of dark pools is Poisson distributed, but rather that the work that we've done previously provides a very general model, and those with greater information will be able to use that and create more informed models that will perform better in the end. So the conclusions that we have to summarize the work that we did was we extended work by previous authors to add a lit pool in the dark pool problem setting. And then we showed that they retained their original optimality properties that were shown by previous work, and we also simulated them in a new environment. Some regulatory implications that we have are that it confirms that dark pools do have some benefit to classes of traders. Even when there's a lot of lit pool liquidity available, there's still very clear incentives for traders to trade in dark pools, and this might suggest that instead of limiting their use, the regulations should be aimed more at ensuring their fairness. So the simulations that we have kind of implicitly have the assumption that dark pools are operating fairly. They have the assumption that all the liquidity that's available is going to be available to any trader who interacts with that lit pool. There's nothing shady going on in the background, and so these are the kind of regulations that we would support rather than those that limit their use. But yeah, thank you for listening to the work that I've done. I'm happy to take any questions now.
Okay, we have time for questions. Alan?
What shady things could be occurring in the background since you opened up the question?
Sure. So some incentives can be kind of modified by who is running a dark pool, for example. So you could have a broker-dealer who's running a dark pool themselves, and they might want to benefit clients they have a better relationship with, for example. So instead of having a very well-defined algorithm for when orders are going to be executed, in a lit pool, things like when your order is sent is going to be really important. But if they want to advantage a certain client, for example, can put everyone else on hold for a second and then execute their orders first. And this isn't necessarily a fair market practice, but since no one has access to the information of when orders are being placed and when they're actually getting executed, it's a lot harder to, it's much easier for them to kind of mess around in this way.
Does that go on? Do you believe, is that happening? Because in fact, there's a player on the other side of the dark side who's optimizing something that I don't think you have in your objective function, right? Because this is a game, right?
Sure.
Right? And, what is, do you have, or do you feel that they're doing some things, changing the rules of the game as it evolves here, or reacting to what you're doing, so that in fact you're doing some things or whatever, or anything like that?
I think that definitely there's been regulatory pushes that have shown that this has happened in the past. Whether this is something that is continuing to happen, I'd have to speculate at. But I guess to get to the second point of it kind of being a game, I think that there ends up being more information that you can extract from a dark pool than is necessarily incorporated in this model. So something like placing a small order to see if there's liquidity available might have different market implications that people can use to get information, which isn't necessarily against the rules of the game, but is maybe using it in a manner that it wasn't necessarily intended for.
Renee?
Could you explain the difference between a dark pool and hidden orders? Sometimes
Yeah.
you can put on a late market order and request that the order is hidden. So what's the difference between a dark pool and a hidden order?
So yeah, one big difference is that when a hidden order is executed against, I still believe everyone can see that there was an execution that took place.
Depend on the exchange.
So then that liquidity in this model, you could kind of incorporate the hidden liquidity in a lit pool as another dark pool, essentially. That's like one way you can incorporate that into this model. They end up being very similar.
Other questions? I have a couple. Maybe I just ask one following Alan. So do you think in terms of policy implications, it'd be fair to ask dark pools to reveal the algorithm, but still, they would still have benefits for people who want to keep the impact low, right?
Absolutely, yeah. I think that, dark pools that are, say, attached to exchanges, for example, some, like NYSE and NASDAQ can run their own dark pools, they already do anyway, in just for the sake of having that transparency. So that's something that even if it's asked that they do, there's still kind of that extra step of ensuring that's actually followed.
Yeah. So, yeah, they need to be regulated. So.
Yeah. So some things that people, some ideas people have are things like, maybe giving it a time delay instead of revealing everything as it's actually happening, have some sort of time delay so people can kind of pour over and make sure that things are actually going as they're intended to be.
Other questions? Now I ask a second quick one. In the plot you had where you don't place orders in the light pools at the beginning, I understand the impact reason for this, but is it also because you want to learn the liquidity of the dark pools, or is there a way of separating the two effects? Let's say if you assume you know the liquidity at the beginning and rerun the optimization problem.
Right. So one of the things that we did here that I didn't talk about is we kind of established two different baselines for how we were going to compare the results of these simulations. So one of them was what if we didn't learn at all, and one of them was what if we had perfect information to begin with. So yeah, we do see that some of the loss in the beginning is from learning, and it turns out, and like the way that we encourage learning is through that optimistic shift that I kind of briefly touched on earlier, is that actually enforces a rate of placing orders to every dark pool to ensure that there's some learning that's happening.
Excellent. Thanks so much. So let's thank Harry again. Okay, great. Our next speaker is Serena Ren, advised by Miki. Go ahead.
Hi everyone, so my name is Serena Ren, and today I'll be presenting my thesis, which is titled Automating Art Appraisals, Machine Learning for Art Valuation. So there's a rising importance in the use of machine learning and financial modeling to automate art market valuations for more illiquid, inefficient, and opaque markets like art and real estate. The more accurate long-term price predictions can really reduce risk and increase productivity. But valuing art assets, which are usually sold in auctions, require much complexity and nuance. So for example, as you see in the photo on the left, it's just a banana stuck to the wall with duct tape. And in 2019, 2 of these 3 bananas were sold for $150,000. On the right is the auction for a Da Vinci painting. It was sold for a record-breaking $450 million. But at the time of this auction, it wasn't even authenticated as Da Vinci's work, and just a decade earlier, it was sold for $10,000. So as you know, it's a little bit confusing and seems very irrational. And it seems like it is based on kind of the unpredictable preferences of buyers and collectors of art. So by far, right now, the experienced judgment and eye of art appraisers are still kind of the primary tool used to value artwork itself. So here is kind of a general layout of what an art auction looks like. So art auctions are typically English auctions. They are open cry, first price, and ascending bid. You have an auctioneer, an art handler, and the bidders kind of sit in a row and have their paddles ready if they want to bid for the artwork that's been presented. The auction houses as well will also publish a pre-sale kind of estimate range that they think the artwork will sell for, and this is what they use as kind of a representative of what they think the value of art is, as well as for the bidders as well. It's like a good reference for them when they look for art that they want to bid for. So in general, there's been an explosive growth in the art market recently. In 2021, the art market is valued at $65 billion. It's a record valuation since the recovery of COVID. The top 3 auction houses are Sotheby's, Christie's, and Phillips, and they take over around 70% of total market share in value of art, with only 10% of volume of art sold. So the main objective of this thesis is, 1, to figure out what factors drive the price of art, and 2nd, to build a model that can maybe mimic or surpass the judgment and eye of art appraisers to predict art prices. So there are many challenges with predicting the pricing movements in art markets. For example, the durable nature and authentications are 2 main factors. If you have an artwork that is known to be a Da Vinci painting, for example, but it's been proven to be a forgery, the price of that artwork will decline dramatically. And vice versa as well. If an artwork that is from an unknown artist was sold for maybe a couple $1,000s, if it was authenticated to be painted by someone who is extremely well known, then that artwork will be priced at a very, very high price. So being able to elevate this appraisal process with efficiency and accuracy of technology is really important to the growth of the art market by adding liquidity and accessibility of data as well. There has been some literature in the area recently, but there has been no kind of successful models so far that have been able to surpass the estimates of auction houses and art appraisers. And one of these main challenges is due to kind of missing data and accessibility, as well as a lot of these papers have a lack of reproducibility as well. So therefore, one of the main challenges for my thesis is to really just like be able to collect the historical data for art auctions. But in the end, we were able to collect 0.4 million data points. They were scraped from two main databases, ArtNet and Mutual Art. They're from Christie's, Sotheby's, and Phillips from 2010 to 2021. And I only focused on works on paper, paintings, and prints since they're 2D, and the image data we'd collected as well were more accurately represented this way. So in general, the data we collected, we have features on the artwork itself, the artist, and the auctions that they were auctioned at, as well as the image as well. So from these data points that we had collected and cleaned, we used our dependent variable was the price of an artwork. Just as a side note, the price of artwork, we pre-processed a little bit to account for geography, time value of money, inflation, et cetera, So our final kind of units for the price of an artwork is in grams of gold. And we also took the natural log of that to kind of adjust for any skewness. So we have a general kind of normal price distribution as well. So from that data, we ran two main types of regressions, linear regressions and neural networks. So for the first kind of model-wise, we have a lot of different categorical variables, including like title, medium. There's just so many different combinations out there, and a lot of these are very descriptive. So we had to create a lot of dummy variables. And here are some kind of examples of dummy variables we created. For title and medium especially, we looked at kind of common words and common categories in these variables and used these as our main dummy variables. And for the neural network, we ran a couple different ones. So first, we used only the textual and numerical data and ran an MLP. We also only used the image data and ran a custom convolutional neural network. Addition to this, we also attempted more known models by applying transfer learning to ResNet 50, which is a ImageNet image recognition network that has already been trained before. And lastly, to combine all the data that we'd collected, we ran a combination model, which used the output of our MLP and our CNN, and then ran it through two more layers of the neural network. And that one is using our numerical, textual, and image data as well. So to answer our first question, what factors drive the price of artwork? So for this, we have the different independent variables we ran for our linear regression. I color-coded it in the sense that green shows kind of a positive correlation with the price of art, and red kind of indicates a negative correlation with the price of art. So just kind of in general, you can see that larger artworks that are usually signed or have some unique factor to it are usually higher priced. Also, oil and acrylic paintings on canvas are usually also favored by bidders and collectors. And interestingly, like title-wise, most common titles are not favored by collectors and bidders, except for self-portraits as well. And then we used the R-squared metric to look at the performance of our different models. Our final kind of best model that we had proposed is the combination model of MLP with ResNet 50, which gave us an R-squared of 0.618. Ultimately, it was able to surpass the R-squared of the auction estimates, which had an R-squared of 0.893. But ultimately, it gave us a lot of interesting work on the drivers of art, as well as kind of a strong foundation for models to come. So just in summary, our thesis, we collected, cleaned, and constructed a data set of 0.4 million auction artworks. We were able to quantify the contribution of artwork attributions as well as drivers. And then we finally proposed pricing models to estimate the sale price of auction artworks. So obviously, the advantages of neural networks is it can be continuously tuned and continuously built on. So with a larger data scope, different features, we were able to kind of increase the predictive power of the models that we had already proposed. Additionally, the data set we had collected, as well as kind of the structure and the framework around the data set we'd collected, is already also very useful, as there have been students at Princeton, more like kind of juniors who are doing their IW have reached out and are starting to use the data set that I've collected as well. And I can't really end this presentation without talking about the growth of the art market in the past couple of years, especially with the NFT art boom in the past 2 years. So of course, the NFT art boom is set to really transform what the art market will look like. And the reason for that is NFT, which stands for non-fungible token art, is just really unique in the sense that it really defies a lot of what the art kind of market stands for on its own. And the market itself, of course, is a lot more liquid, it's a lot more efficient. There's no time lag between kind of an announcement of an auction and the auction itself, or the announcement of an auction estimate and the auction itself. There's a lot more transparency, all the marketplaces are online, so you get a lot of accessible data for kind of the transactions of NFT art. Because NFT art is also influenced strongly by kind of word of mouth and social media, and the value of digital art is all speculative, it would be really interesting to be able to kind of model the price of NFT art as well, and will be really helpful for models that, estimate the traditional art auction market as well, since models in previous literature as well as my proposed models haven't really taken into account social media, speculation, things like that. And yeah, that's a little bit of overview of my thesis. Thank you so much. Happy to take questions.
Thank you, Serena. Any questions? Serena?
Does it spread prediction banana or like weird things like that?
Yeah, so the banana is definitely an anomaly. The artist is also relatively unknown. He's a contemporary Italian artist who's done a lot of outrageous things like this. I haven't specifically, it'd be really interesting, I haven't specifically looked at what the model spits out for that particular artwork. But I think with kind of his history of doing all these outrageous pieces, maybe it'll be able to kind of account for it. But definitely a lot of it was speculation, word of mouth, just people being really ridiculous with wanting to buy a banana on the wall. The last one was eaten by someone as well. So that's a fun fact. Yeah.
Other questions? Alan?
When you talked about cleaning the data, what did you do? What did you transform from what to what when you cleaned?
Yeah, no, that's a really great question. So because a lot of the databases for our auction prices are built for appraisers and collectors and buyers, they're really designed for one-time lookups and very specific searches and things like that. So there's no function that allows you to download large quantitative data sets. So a lot of what the cleaning that I did was being able to download manually and scrape manually these different databases, and then from HTML files and PDF files, extract the data from that and clean it so it's there's a good format and it's readable and able to be put into models.
Did you do anything differently for the non-fungible token data than you did for the other pieces of art?
Yes.
More normal, I mean, did because of their description and so on, and data that you could get, and is there anything structurally different? I mean,
yeah, no, that's a great question. I didn't look at NFT kind of art data for this particular project, but actually looked at it for a project I was doing for Mickey's class for his networks class. And the data itself is definitely pretty different in terms of what data is available. So a lot of NFT art also is based in collections, and also there's a lot of data on the artists and the buyers themselves, historical data and transaction data. So there's a lot of different angles you can go with NFT art data that's not kind of founded and grounded in the auctions and geography and things like that.
Renee, you had a question?
That's all right.
Go ahead. We have to.
No, I'll find out later what my Beanie Baby investment are, so that's all right.
Yeah, I had a similar comment. There's this website, Masterworks, which allows people to invest in, you can own, 0.01% of the Picasso. Do you think that has changed the way the prices fluctuate?
That's a really interesting point. I think based on the work I've done here and just like thinking about the art market as a whole, it probably won't have a significant kind of difference or kind of change in how the traditional art market will work, just because a lot of it is still very kind of grounded in like in-person auctions or just like the event of an auction itself. And maybe having people be able to invest in a like 0.1% of a Picasso, it will maybe help with showing the popularity and reputation of these works. But in general, a lot of it is still really based on just the art itself.
Go ahead, please.
Are you doing overfitting? Did you put in like your training set and validation set?
Yes, so I use training set and validation set and a testing set. So I split it kind of with, I think, 7 to 8 years as a training set, and then 2 years and 2 years for the validation and testing set. And I also did a lot of hyperparameter tuning for my different models as well to make sure it wasn't overfitting.
All right, if there are no more questions, thanks Serena again. Next speaker is Mitchell, advised by Professor Kornhauser here.
Hi, so the title of my thesis was How Advanced Are Advanced Stats, a comparison of player production metrics for NBA competition, and my advisor was Professor Kornhauser. So, on the screen are the career in-game or per-game statistics for 2 different basketball players. The categories shown comprise of the stats that are traditionally recorded in a basketball box score. Now, based on this data, could you definitively determine which player had a better career? If so, you will have solved an argument that the basketball community has spent an excessive amount of time debating. Who's the GOAT, LeBron James or Michael Jordan? While talking heads have tried to solve this argument with subjective topics like clutchness and charisma, the analytics community is attempting to take a more concrete, quantitative approach. One of these approaches involves attempting to compress all available data into a single, easily digestible value that can easily be compared across players. On the screen is a new analytical perspective for how we can value the careers of LeBron James and Michael Jordan. It includes a couple new advanced stats which attempt to quantify their performance in a single number. But we still don't know which one of these advanced statistics is doing the best job at quantifying their production. That's where my thesis comes in. The goal of the thesis is to analyze and compare different advanced metrics' ability to evaluate player performance. This is done by measuring their accuracy in predicting past game outcomes. By past games, I mean games from which the advanced stats have already incorporated information about the player performance in those games. The idea being that advanced stats which better measure a player's production in those games will be better at predicting the final outcome.
Just for information, could you go back one?
Yeah.
Could you tell us what these are? I don't know any of them.
Yeah, so I'm going to dive into the big ones. Some of them do not fit the goal of my thesis, or just this one, which is VORP, which depends on playing time, but I'm going to explain every one of them other than that coming up.
And a big number is better than a small number on all of them?
What's that?
A big number is better than a small number on each?
Yes. Always big number better than small number. Yeah. So these are the 4 metrics examined in this thesis. Each of these metrics was chosen first for their prominence in the basketball community and second for their structure. Each of these is calculated on a per basis, either per 48 minutes played by a player or per 100 possessions played. So, and that particular aspect of each set is essential to the methodology of the thesis, which is why they were chosen. So the 4 are as follows: player efficiency rating, or PER, which is a pace-adjusted measure of the production by a player per 48 minutes played; win shares per 48 minutes, or win shares per 48, which is a pace-adjusted measure of the wins contributed by a player to his team per 48 minutes played; box plus minus, or BPM, which attempts to estimate the point contribution by a player to his team above league average per 100 possessions played; and Raptor, which has a much longer title that I won't read, which attempts to do the same thing as BPM, but with a different data set and a slightly different methodology. So all of these are advanced stats, but the thesis is going to be examining game outcomes, which are decided by teams. So it was necessary to accumulate all the individual stats into a team rating. This thesis did so by taking a weighted average of each team using minutes played as the weight. And it's important to remember that it's feasible to do this in this manner because each of these are calculated on a per basis. Therefore, you can estimate a player's production in a game given the combination of their advanced stat and their minutes played. And these team ratings were then used to calculate game outcomes using 3 different machine learning techniques. The first was a linear regression, which was used to examine totals, which is a term for the sum of points to be scored by both teams, spreads, which is a term for the margin of victory in the game, and money lines, which is a prediction of which team will win the game. A logistic regression and a support vector machine were also used to predict money lines. The training data for these models came from NBA regular season games starting in the 2013 to 14 NBA season, running through the 2019 to 2020 NBA season, and then they were 2013 being the first year Raptor was collected, which is why I chose that year, and then they were tested against approximately 2,000 NBA games from the next 2 seasons. And their accuracy was tested against totals, spreads, and money lines, which were put forth by Vegas sportsbooks. So the results. Raptor was the most accurate, with the highest accuracy in each category, the biggest margin being in point total prediction. BPM was the next most accurate, followed by win shares per 48, and per was the least accurate in every category, particularly lagging in spread prediction, but it was closer to the others in predicting money lines. So this experiment is certainly not a definitive conclusion as to which advanced stat is best, but it can give us some valuable insights into how we can better evaluate players. I believe Raptor had the highest accuracy because it has the best approach to solving a long-standing problem in the basketball community, which is how to value defensive production. Traditional box score defensive data is very limited, with only 2 statistics included, blocks and steals. While these are valuable contributions, they're only a very small piece of a large array of ways a player can contribute to his team defensively. I believe that Raptor incorporates 2 new data sets not used in the other 3 statistics. These are player tracking data, which tracks the location of all 10 players and the ball 25 times per second in each game, and on-off ratings, which track the performance of a team when a player is on the floor versus off of it. I believe that by incorporating these new data sets, it's likely that Raptor is better capturing defensive performance compared to its peers. So this video is an example of how this could possibly be occurring.
Cavaliers by 3. And I like the
So watch Kevin Love, who's about to be guarding the ball after this switch right here, guard Steph Curry.
Curry steps back, fakes a 3, drives again, shut off nicely, found to Green, 7 to shoot. Curry fakes the 3, steps back, crossover, puts up a 3. Rebound James with 30 seconds remaining.
Okay, so in this play, Kevin Love made a superb defensive stop, preventing Steph Curry, a 2-time MVP, from scoring not once, but twice. However, in a traditional basketball box score, he would receive no credit because he did not record a block and he did not record a steal. But with player tracking data and on-off ratings, he would receive credit. With player tracking data, he would be credited as being the nearest player to a missed shot by the opponent. And with on-off ratings, he would be credited for being on the floor when his team made a defensive stop. I believe that by including this new data, Raptor is better capturing defensive value. And I think this is particularly reflected by its superior performance in predicting point totals. Point totals are arguably the category that is most influenced by defensive performance of each team, because better defensive teams will allow less points, while bad defensive teams will allow more points. So I believe by incorporating new data sets, Raptor is doing a better job at evaluating player production. I then turned towards analyzing whether I could accurately predict future outcomes. By future outcomes, I mean games from which the advanced stats have incorporated no information from the outcomes of the games. So to do this, team ratings had to be modified to only include information that was available prior to the game beginning. Success was then measured by examining the betting performance of the various predictions. And 2 different approaches were taken. First, I placed uniform bets on all predictions outputted by the models. And second, I placed weighted bets using the Kelly growth criterion to determine the weights. And that was done specifically with the logistic regression because the output of the logistic regression perfectly matched the inputs of the Kelly growth criterion to determine the weight of the bet to place. So the results from my predictions. For both betting methodologies, results were largely as expected, with slight losses coming. The models were unable to overcome the house advantage. My spread and total prediction accuracy hovered right around 50%, performing the same as the average bettor would. And my moneyline prediction was slightly better than the average bettor, but overall returns remained negative because the significant house advantage was not overcome by the predictions. So my recommendation would be, do not bet against the house. Overall, the betting market was found to be efficient. While I did have some success in examining in predicting underdogs, I believe this was mostly due to luck. Underdogs, by their nature of being long shots, have the highest variance of payout, and also I examined the least of these, a little over 300. And so I think due to the high variance and low sample size, I got a little lucky, made a little bit of profit, but not much. And a different outcome on 2 or 3 bets would have put me in the negative. So I think in the long run, I still would not have been making any money. Sportsbooks operate with a significant advantage over bettors that is very hard to overcome. And any inefficiencies that are there are likely to be removed quickly by a flood of smart money. So in summation, I would recommend do not place your nest egg in the hands of sportsbooks and instead give it to someone like Professor Mulvey.
I must say thank you for those results. I mean, it's a good thing you got those results. Otherwise, I would have been very unhappy.
Mickey has a question.
I was wondering, just kind of at a big picture level, about the game of basketball. And like, if you compare different eras of basketball, they're like almost completely different games. Like Steph Curry changed the game 10 years ago completely. So I was wondering, like, how much you can see that in the data, and also like, moving forward, like with these new, more accurate measures of data, can you kind of predict what's the gradient of better performance, and how will the game change? Like, what is it going to be all Giannis, or all what is the next? Where is the game headed?
Yeah. So each of these attempts to take the context of the time period into their calculation. So they'll use league averages for each stat in their calculation. So theoretically, across eras, it should remain consistent despite different styles of play. Maybe that's not necessarily the case, but it seems to be overall. In terms of predicting future performance, I think, or future, where the game goes in the future, I think just generally, when we can better evaluate players, we can see which players are more valuable, and money will eventually flow towards them in free agency. They'll draft players that fit these types, and players that are valued higher will be eventually, the league will reflect that. So I guess it's kind of a reflection of what the numbers value, and I think that's probably good.
Other questions from Mitch? A quick one: is Raptor the only advanced metric that uses motion capture data?
So ESPN has another called Real Plus Minus. The reason it actually fits the structure of that was used in the thesis. The reason I didn't use it is the data that was available to me online was incomplete. It didn't include every player in the NBA, and because it was comprehensively examining each team or all players that played, I didn't want to synthesize data for those players that were missing, so I didn't examine those. Those are the two. I'm not aware of any others currently. I think it would be a cool thing to try and incorporate that data into the 3 other statistics in their calculation.
Thank you.
Just
Yes,
quickly,
please.
did you answer the question, which is better of those 2?
I asked him last week.
So, yes,
and if you give the wrong answer, be careful.
Someone looked into it, and they estimate the Raptor for Michael Jordan because they don't have the player tracking data, but their estimation bared out that Michael Jordan was the better player overall.
Come on, I like LeBron.
I was just counting which ones had the bigger number.
Is there any player that has even higher Raptor than?
So I don't quite recall. Michael Jordan's had the 7 highest seasons, but I believe Nikola Jokic's, I don't recall exactly, but was regarded as one of the better seasons of all time. I couldn't place it. I don't exactly remember, but he had the highest Raptor this season, and it was remarkably high.
Oh, we can count the rings. All right, let's thank Mitchell again. All right, so this is the last little session with 2 talks on finance. I remind you again that we have a reception in room 125, and if our faculty especially could stay, we're going to take some pictures. I encourage all of you to attend if you have the time. The first speaker is Jack Woll, advised by Professor Metteson.
Thank you so much. Thank you to everyone for coming. I'm Jack Woll, and over the past year I've been very lucky to have been advised by Professor Sohner on my thesis, Pairs Trading and Volatility. The rise of the COVID-19 pandemic has brought newfound volatility to financial markets across the world, whether driven by consumer fears or, as Alan Greenspan famously characterized, irrational exuberance. These volatile market conditions have created an environment in which savvy traders can profit from asset mispricings using statistical arbitrage. As such, this thesis contributes to the pairs trading literature by demonstrating that both trivial and non-trivial asset mispricings exist in modern financial markets, illustrating how to systematically identify and exploit these enduring anomalies. This graph shows the daily high of the VIX, a volatility index whose current level is derived from prices of options on the S&P 500. I use it as a proxy for the volatility found in the US financial market. We observe that the VIX has risen above 80 2 times in the past 30 years. Once during the 2007-2008 financial crisis, and once more during the initial wave of COVID lockdowns in March 2020. As such, this thesis evaluates the performance of pairs trading algorithms during key periods of volatility in modern times, trading on data during the lead up to the burst of the dot-com bubble, all the way to the present-day Russian invasion of Ukraine. To concretely define the scope of my thesis' research, my thesis evaluates pairs trading strategies using distance, correlation, and co-integration as metrics to quantify co-movement between considered assets. It simulates trades on US public equities and ETF data between 1990 and 2022. And most importantly, it demonstrates that pairs trading strategies remain robust to conservative transaction cost models during periods of economic downturn and heightened financial market volatility. So to begin this section, I'll first define what pairs trading is. Pairs trading involves selecting 2 co-moving assets, then opening a market-neutral arbitrage portfolio when the normalized price difference between those 2 assets diverges, and closing that portfolio to profit when their prices converge once more. As such, an assumption of mean reversion underlies pairs trading, meaning that statistical arbitrageurs need to select co-moving assets that have a strong relationship to a shared underlying long-term mean. One intuitive choice for a pairs portfolio could be 2 share classes for the same company that trade on the same exchange, such as that which is shown here, Google Class A and Google Class C. However, the beauty of this thesis is in its ability to identify non-trivial co-moving stock pairings, such as that which is shown here, Kroger, a US-based supermarket chain, and Vips, a Chinese-based e-commerce company. Another particularly amusing one, but also profitable one, proved to be McDonald's, which we all know, and Infosys, an India-based information technology company. In pairs trading, there are 2 phases. The first, which is a formation period in which we identify potential pairs for trading, and then the trading period, which immediately follows the formation period, where we execute trades based off of divergences from those pairs' long-term means. In my simulation, I set formation periods to be 1 year in length, as consistent with the literature, and I have each trading period that follows be 6 months long. Additionally, I begin a new trading period, formation period combination at the beginning of each calendar month in the year, meaning that at any given time, we will have up to 6 distinct trading periods that will be open. So, in a given formation period, to select the top 20 pairs combinations, which is consistent with the literature, you you typically select 20 pairs as your overall portfolio and trade those. We first perform exclusions on the 1,000 most liquid stocks traded on all US exchanges at any given time. We then select the top 20 stock pairings according to each selection metric associated with a given method. The sum of squared differences between normalized price series in the case of the distance method, the correlation between normalized price series in the case of the correlation method, and in the case of the co-integration method, we calculate the t-statistic associated with the Engel-Granger two-step co-integration test. So for our trading algorithm, it proves very heuristically simple. We open a pairs portfolio when the normalized difference between the two stock prices exceeds a certain z-score, and we close that portfolio when it falls within a certain z-score bound. Also, to mimic reality, we include a stop-loss limit in our trading simulation, and we recognize that choices of these parameters may lead to bias in results. As such, we vary these parameters through sensitivity analysis to generate a distribution of returns over these parameters to allow us to understand how our returns change when we change these parameters. We also perform three main robustness checks in our simulation. First, we factor in transaction costs to simulate real-world market frictions in our simulation. We also include soon-to-be delisted stocks in our traded pairs to ensure that we eliminate survivorship bias in our results. And third, we bootstrap random pairs to show that our pair selection algorithms generate meaningful pairings. Our transaction cost model has three parts: commissions, which we vary with time to reflect the decrease in commissions over time; market impact, which we take from the literature as a constant over time; and short selling fees, which we hold as a constant percentage per annum. Now, we mentioned earlier that we ran these algorithms on ETF data and stock data. However, when we ran these algorithms on ETF and stock data, we found that it only selected ETF pairs and produced some relatively uninteresting results, such as pairing the Vanguard Russell 100 Growth ETF with the iShares Russell Growth 100 ETF. As we can see here, the selected pairs that minimized our co-movement metrics very seldom traded because they tracked, in the case of the ETFs, very stable underlying assets such as gold, silver, and even treasury bonds. So we can see that minimizing the co-movement metrics that we've chosen in pairs trading doesn't necessarily guarantee that these strategies will be profitable, and that we need a certain level of volatility in our underlying assets to generate profits from these strategies. So for completeness, we note that we calculate the return on a given trade in terms of the excess dollar returned on a given portfolio in excess of the initial capital invested in the long leg of that pairs portfolio. So to determine how our strategies fared in periods of economic downturn, we classified our overall time horizon into 8 sub-periods based off of whether they were a bull or a bear market. And so we can see that we produce some pretty phenomenal returns with our methods. So these numbers here are the 6-month net return of transaction costs on average over this entire time horizon. So in each 6-month trading period, for example, during the dot-com bubble burst, the correlation method returned on average 44%. And so what we can see is that during periods of economic downturn, sub-periods 2, 4, and 6, we see a massive outperformance of what we would expect and very significant returns, as well as a very tight distribution over the 21 different parameter combinations that we selected. Now, to return to the VIX graph from earlier, we observed that the periods of highest return also coincide with maxima in the VIX curve, supporting our initial proposition that periods of highest volatility lead to periods of high return for our pair selection algorithms. Now, penultimately, we'll dive into 2 case studies to see what fuels the success of our pairs trading algorithms and what might lead to some shortcomings. So on this slide, we have a graph of the distribution of all trade returns for the trading period from March 1st to September 1st of 2020. And we can see that it has a bell curve shape with a noticeably non-zero mean and a heavier right tail than a left tail. We also notice that there are a fair amount of trades in this window, with each pair in the 20 selected pairs portfolio trading roughly 2 to 3 times per month, showing that frequent reversions to the mean in the ideal case are what fuels the profits of pairs trading. And we can also see that these frequent reversions to the mean also implies that divergences from the long-term mean prove temporary because even though there was the systematic shock of the economic downturn due to COVID, broader economic recovery helped all companies return to their long-term means, which stands in contrast to the next slide, which focuses on the trading algorithm's success or lack thereof during the Russian invasion of Ukraine. We can see that the bell curve shape has disappeared and the trades are largely unprofitable. And the intuition behind this result that I believe is because while COVID was a systematic shock, this was an asymmetric shock to the global economy, where business relationships were left in shambles as Russia invaded Ukraine, meaning that divergences between long-term trends were rendered permanent. And so we reflect on our overall return distribution saying, by remarking that our transaction cost model is very conservative relative to that which is found in the literature, but also for individuals working for larger financial institutions, the frictions that we outlined may vanish, meaning that individuals who recreate this may achieve even higher returns than that which we've outlined in this presentation. So to conclude, first, we've demonstrated that pairs trading yields significant returns during periods of heightened financial market volatility and economic downturn. Second, we've demonstrated that non-trivial pairings and mispricings exist, and that identifying and exploiting these mispricings leads to superior returns. Third, we've demonstrated that our methods remain robust to transaction costs in modern times. And to conclude, in today's world, where black box models and neural nets have captivated quantitative finance at large, we've demonstrated that intuitive, elegant models for arbitrage can find enduring success in modern financial markets. Thank you.
Thank you, Jack. Questions? Ronnie.
So in this example that you gave, Kroger's is correlated with the Chinese firm. I mean, they're correlated through COVID, right? And then you showed like March 2020 to May 2020. But how long does it last? And how do you know, when to get out of this? I mean, they're correlated for a short period of time because of the shock, right? But then if you keep persisting with this, you're going to lose everything that you gain because you don't know when they become, I mean, the situation in China and the U.S. is very different now.
Right. And so, at least what I think led to a lot of the profitability was because we set the formation periods to be 1 year long. So because we're having these rolling throughout time, it updates its understanding of the relationship between the two assets as you go. And so I think that given the results that it is enough time to allow it to be profitable without it being punished for any other divergences that might become apparent.
Other questions? I have a sort of similar question. So one of your methods that chooses the two pairs based on highest correlation. So that would very much depend on how the correlation matrix is computed. Are you using a factor model or is this the sample covariance matrix?
I used pandas covariance, which it was a Python method. I think it was a sample covariance matrix. Yes, Professor.
Jack, have you got into why they were correlated, this thing with McDonald's and the Indian IT company? We talked about this also before, but did you find out that there's any physical connection between these two companies, trade deals or something like that, or just statistics?
From my cursory research, I could not find a trend. I think that it is purely statistical relationship.
Money at the end of the day?
It did. The trades that did happen did make money in excess of transaction costs. That I did confirm in the data.
Just want to understand pairs trading. So when you choose two assets, you buy the same amount, buy or sell but the same amount. So you're not making a decision as to how much to go long or short in each.
Right.
The same amount.
Right. I assume that the long and short position are the same, and I also assume that in a given like once we've moved from the formation period to the trading period, I assume uniform capital allocation. So I don't assume that going into the trading period that any pair's portfolio is more likely to be more successful than others. Because even though we may have a slightly higher correlation during the formation period, as we discussed in the middle of the presentation, co-movement metrics don't guarantee profits, which is what led me to have this uniform capital scheme. But on the pairs portfolio level, yes, I did make sure it was a market neutral portfolio.
Okay. Yes, Professor.
Yeah, let me try. Did you look for correlations between two asset pairs where one was a leading indicator of the other to then use that aspect of it to do your trading?
I did when I was formulating my methods, like looking at more methods and statistics like Granger causality, but I elected to not use those methods for sake of simplicity in the model. I just looked for the consistency in the long-term relationship to the mean, as opposed to causality between the two assets. That movements in one then predict the movements in the other.
Okay. Any other questions? Not, let's thank Jack one more time. Okay, I forgot to say the order, in case you didn't notice, is alphabetical. So last but not least, we have Andre Yang.
My last name and not first name.
Yeah, it would have been the opposite. Is advised by John Ching Fang.
Well, hi everyone, dean, professors, staff, fellow classmates and students. Thank you for staying here until the very end. I am very honored to see all of you still here. My name is Andre. I had the distinct pleasure and honor of being advised by Professor Fan, and welcome to my TED Talk. So my thesis is on constructing equity trading strategies based on macroeconomic event analysis. And so just a little bit about the table of contents here. We're first going to talk about my goal for this thesis, and then spend some time talking about background of what's macroeconomics and technical analysis, followed briefly by workflow, and then I want to spend the bulk of the time talking about key results, because I think that's most useful and also most interesting. So my goal here is basically to analyze about 140 different macroeconomic news releases or so in the United States. These would include things like the jobs report, unemployment claims, continuous jobless claims, GDP growth, all of these factors, and then see if I could look at what the analysts are forecasting versus what the actual figures are, and see if I could use that differential and some other factors to make some predictions in the equity markets. So let's say if the jobs report is coming out soon. We have what the analysts are forecasting versus what the numbers are. What is the price of the S&P 500 30 minutes before and 30 minutes after? Am I able to use the news release to actually forecast that price there? So past research has used macroeconomic news releases to analyze the bonds market, and that makes sense because if we consider factors like interest rates or inflation, I mean, those directly have to do with bond prices. But much less research has actually focused on using macro releases to analyze the equity markets. And then on top of that, I wanted to throw in a technical analysis component as well. So looking at technical indicators like moving averages, momentum indicators, seeing if I could combine those with macro releases in order to forecast equity prices. So like I mentioned before, these are examples of macroeconomic indicators. These are basically ways of measuring the overall economic health of our economy. And then with technical analysis, it's more so about looking at candlesticks, more so about looking at price trends, momentum, and so on. So a brief description of the workflow here. So the first step is to actually obtain data for the macroeconomic news releases. So I got this data via Bloomberg Terminal. On the y-axis here, we basically have the predicted price change. So what is the price change 30 minutes before the release versus 30 minutes after? And then on the x-axis here is surprise. So what are analysts forecasting for this release versus what is the actual figures for the release and then normalized by the standard deviation of forecasts. And then for each release, of course, I want to see what the price for the SP 500 intraday data is before and after the release. So we turn to our good friend here, UPenn, which is a good source of intraday data for these indices. And then I would go on to construct some models, linear regressions, and also more complicated machine learning models in order to make my forecasts. So my inputs for these models would include things like, what is the R-squared of these releases here? What is the seasonality of the release? What's the directionality? What is the analyst surprise? And so on and so forth. And then my output for the machine learning models is basically what is the predicted price change before and after the release. And then using the machine learning model outputs, we would then construct our trading strategies. So just as an example, let's say with the jobs report again, our linear regressions or our models forecast that, let's say, we expect the SP 500 data to grow by 1% before versus after the release. And let's say at the time that prediction comes out, the SP 500 has already grown by, let's say, 0.5%. So in that case, based on our model prediction, we still see that the SP 500 has another 0.5% to grow. And so we'd go long on the market. And then in the other case, we'd go short on the market accordingly. And finally, the fun part, we get to construct some metrics. So cumulative P&L, that's our bottom line, in addition to expanding Sharpe ratio. And also, what I think is the most interesting is the correlation with our benchmark, which I will get into right now. What is the benchmark? The benchmark is basically buying and holding the SP 500 during the times that we're actually trading our strategies. So if I'm placing an order into the market for the next hour, I'm comparing that to buying and holding the SP 500 during the next hour as well. So I kind of split my project into two parts. First part is macro only. So this is ignoring technical analysis now. Macro only. If we compare our best performing strategies with the benchmark, we see that our strategies actually outperform the benchmark by 3 times in terms of cumulative P&L, which is pretty cool. And Sharpe ratio is not too bad either, 0.6. And I think the most interesting part, though, is a near zero correlation. Because typically, if we're comparing strategies with the buy and hold, we would expect some kind of a positive correlation. But in this case, and I ran some statistical tests of significance on this too, a near zero correlation is pretty cool because it means that our strategy could serve as an effective hedging measure, especially during periods of high volatility or in a basket of strategies with the market.
Sorry, in your strategy, you buy and sell several times during that period, or is still once?
So usually our holding period would be about an hour, so like half an hour before, half an hour after the release, and then the testing points cumulatively span about 8.5 years of data points or so. Yep, of intraday. And so the second part of the project is combining the macro and the technical indicators. And in this case, we see that our cumulative P&L jumps up to 6 times, Sharpe ratio is about 0.9, and still we have about a near zero correlation. So we see, based on the first 2 points, that in general, the macro and technical analysis tends to outperform the macro only. And as is often the case with financial data, our simpler models, so our good friend ordinarily squares and its family, tends to perform better than the more complicated machine learning models. Something else I did was to compare these 2 types of strategies. So the reinvesting strategy is basically I would reinvest my entire portfolio for each trade that I place, versus the fixed sum strategy, which is I would invest a constant X dollars for every trade I place. And it turns out that the reinvesting strategy tends to perform better. So just to dive in briefly, cumulative returns here. There's many colors and many lines on this plot, but basically the bottom line in gray is our benchmark, so that's just buy and holding. And then the colored lines represent various different models. The simpler models tend to outperform the more complicated ones, so we have our good friends, the linear regressions at the very top here. And then in terms of Sharpe ratio, also comparing macro versus macro plus technical, we see that there's quite a bit of volatility here. I will point out one thing though, is towards the beginning, the first few years or so, we can safely disregard because that is a calibration period for the expanding Sharpe ratio. And we see that it hovers around 0.6 and 0.9 respectively. And then, in my opinion, the most interesting part, After running some statistical tests here, we see that the correlation in both of these cases is near 0. So that suggests that there is some potential in combining our strategies with the market strategies and potentially even increasing the Sharpe ratio and reducing the variance of the overall strategy. I want to cap this off by just pointing out a few extensions. There's many things we could do. I think the most prominent one is I want to see how I can turn our strategies into something more practical and more marketable. So currently our benchmark is just buy-in holding for like an hour or so each time. But that's not really industry standard. Industry standard is usually buy-in holding for years on end across daily data. So if there's some way to extend my trading strategy from that 1 hour period to the entire daily period, and so I can just hold on for longer, then I think that provides a more apples to apples comparison with a traditional SPY benchmark. And then I could do some other things as well. For example, I could try using different penalty parameters. I could try using different types of more complicated models with the expectation that simpler tends to perform better. There's a lot of extensions that I could do. This is not meant to be readable. This is for pure comedic effect, including climbing into the Woody Woo fountain with potential clients as we read about how high inflation rates are. That's the best one. So with that, thank you so much everyone for listening, for your attention, and happy to take comments and questions.
Thanks, Andre. Questions?
Sure, I'll ask.
Go ahead.
Seems to me you did pretty well in your half hour to half hour period.
Yeah.
How much better do you think you can do if you extended
it?
I mean,
It's a good question. It's a good question. And
you're taught to say that. Forget that.
Whoa, I know how much you like that phrase. It's to buy me more time as I try to figure out how to answer the question. So I thought about this beforehand, and it would be nice and easy to say, oh, it scales proportionally or whatever. But I don't think that's the case. In fact, I mean, it's hard to know exactly without running the actual tests. So much of what I will be saying right now is probably speculation. But I will say that one thing I did think about is, for example, right now I'm just using a point half an hour before and a point half an hour. I think a good thing to try out for the future research is taking that entire time history, half an hour leading up, half an hour after, or just extending, like, why do half an hour before, half an hour? Try 6 hours before and 6 hours after. Now, the difficulty is, I mean, the markets are only open for so long with the equities. I mean, with bonds, this is not really a problem, but we have to take logistical concerns into account. But yeah, definitely a good note to keep for future research.
Go ahead, please.
Is there a way that you can extend this into like the options market, or this is just correct?
I think so. I think it's definitely going to take a lot more work, especially with options and a lot of other factors to take care of when we're talking about the options markets. I mean, for example, when we went from the bond market to the equity market, we had to be very careful about like markets when the markets are actually open and how that's going to impact liquidity concerns, especially since like we eventually want to market these strategies to large corporations. So with options, we care even more so about liquidity. So that's something that we would have to take into account as we try to extend this strategy.
Forgot to say good question.
Great question.
Any other good questions? Or bad
Only
ones?
good question.
All right, let's thank